I actually feel it's based off circumstances. I don't think anybody would choose poverty. I mean, I don't know what kind of choice that would be.
It's definitely like a multi-headed serpent that you're dealing with here. There's not just one answer that you could just like magically, make everything go away with.
I think we need a lot of more people to lift people up and to walk with them through their situations to get them out of poverty.
What do you guys, when you think about kind of just major misconceptions about people in poverty, what do you hear or what have you had yourself misconception-wise?
Yeah, I would say people believe that poor folk are poor because they're lazy.
Yep.
So they have a poor work habit. And others would say a misconception of poverty would be that they are really unmotivated, or poor people are weak-minded individuals.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's definitely true. I think probably the one we deal with the most at Shepherd is probably the belief that poverty is simply defined by money, and that the primary difference between middle-class folks and people in poverty is just a lack of money. I mean, there will be those things you talked about, but among the people who don't hold that opinion, they would say the primary difference is just a lack of money. And we just know from our experience, everybody who works with the issue of poverty, works with people who've lived in poverty, particularly those in generational poverty, understand that money is only a part of it. The people who are middle class have assets and resources many assets and resources that people in poverty do not. And the problem is the reason that's a big problem is that oftentimes, I mean, if you look at welfare, it was basically giving money to people in poverty. Because if you define poverty as simply a lack of money, that's an easy solution. All we have to do is give them money. But 70 years of welfare, and since 1979, the poverty rate's been going up. And so we can see that intervention of money doesn't really make a difference. We know that there are so many things that people in the middle class possess that people in poverty don't. And if we don't empower our families to have those other resources, and we talk about them all the time, things like emotional strength and mental ability and physical ability, but also support systems and relationships and role models. If we don't empower our families with those things, then a financial intervention doesn't really help. And if we just give people money, it doesn't really make much of a difference. And our work really, because the more of those assets you have, the more stable your life is. And the more stable your life is, the better opportunity your children have to be future-oriented, to think about their future, and to have a brighter future. If all of today's needs are met, I can think about the future. But if every moment of my life is in survival mode,
Right.
I can't really gain any traction.
We see a lot of neighbors spending a lot of time in survival mode.
Right.
And that tyranny of the urgent, of what's immediate for today that I need to take care of, which makes complete sense. That why think about the future? Well, not only can I not think about the future because I've got so many things on my mind about today.
Yeah, and when you use the term tyranny of the urgent with business people, they understand, because they all understand what the tyranny of the urgent is, which is I get to the end of the day and I was really busy, but I didn't really do anything. I didn't really accomplish anything, and every one of us has experienced that day. And so they begin to understand what it means. Well, imagine living every day of your life like that. Every day of your life, never really get any work done on that thing that's due in the future, or that report that's due Friday, and you become basically an unproductive person. If you live your whole life in that survival mode, you really can't gain any traction for the future. So.
I think we hear, those misconceptions that you guys talked about, and then sometimes people follow that up with a question trying to understand a little bit more. what other questions have you guys heard from people asking if they maybe do have a misconception or they just are interested in learning more? Go ahead.
Yeah. I think over the years of interfacing with volunteers who are willing to impact poor people's lives, they ask questions such as, why are women having multiple kids by different men? And that's always seems to be the normal question. And then when I share about my past of growing up in poverty and the Lord just pouring into my life through His people, and people ask questions. So how did you get out? How was it possible for you experiencing poverty, losing my dad? My dad was murdered when I was 10 years old, and the question of, wow, we know that people are in poverty for generations, and how was it that you were able to get out of it? So that's a major question that people asking me based on my history.
Yeah.
And what's your answer?
Yeah, it's the grace of God. It's God using people whom He's raised up to pour into my life and have established life-on-life relationships. And of course, another part of that has been I have the willingness to take advantage of opportunities. So poor people are not always have access to a better life, to better resources. And I was one of the fortunate ones, not only did God send people to me, but I was willing to embrace and do life with folk that wanted to help me. So I had a part to play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually use your story occasionally
Okay.
and talk about a friend of mine. And, I remember you telling your story in detail and talking about the two gentlemen, or the one particular gentleman who worked for the one organization, and how he poured his life into you.
Good.
And I tell people all the time, nothing happens outside of a relationship, no significant learning, no significant growth. And anytime I meet somebody that's broken the cycle of poverty, this is truly from generational poverty. It's usually a person I admire because they've done more than I have with what God has, or with what the opportunities that they've had, I think. But invariably, I've never heard a story that didn't have one person, sometimes two, sometimes three, that made a difference. It was this person. It can be a teacher,
Absolutely.
but only if that teacher really has a long-term relationship with the child.
That's the key.
And it can be an uncle, it can be an aunt, it can be a friend, it can be somebody who just loves the Lord and is committed to pouring himself into other people. But ultimately, it's about relationships.
Absolutely.
And you don't meet somebody who's broken the cycle of poverty unless they've had that in their lives. Sometimes it's just a mother who just says, I'm not going to let you fail.
Yeah.
And I think within those relationships, it's quite challenging. You have to be in it for the long haul. It gets rough at times. And honestly, poor people in general, anyone in general, I think, I would say they don't trust people that they don't know. And so you have to build some relational capital. And that means you got to spend some time doing some hard life with them. And sometimes they don't want to talk to you, or sometimes they don't trust you, and they don't feel like you have their best interests at heart. And you have to weather the storms. And as you were able to show that you are committed to working with the poor, walking with the poor, then they open up to feeling more comfortable about sharing their pains. And then they allow you to come a little closer into their world. But I also think it's important for there to be some reciprocity, where there's some exchange, where even those who were helping the poor could be vulnerable to say that, hey, you know what, I don't have it all together. And I think poor people need to see that. So they don't see themselves as a project, right? Or someone's pet project, if you will. But being able to say, hey, you have struggles just like I have struggles, and how can we do life together? I think that is so important.
Oh, yeah. I remember when we first moved, back to your first point, when we first moved into the Martindale-Brightwood neighborhood, we were white people moving into a predominantly, almost all African-American community, a poor community. And there was an incident. We'd lived there for 6 months, and my son had just been born, and a bullet came through the house. And it scared us, as you might imagine. And my wife, who's always the first to remind me that Satan exists, said, maybe it's just Satan trying to scare us away. And we just, after lots of existential angst and stuff, we decided to stay. Years later, I didn't tell anybody in the neighborhood about it, but there was one boy from the ministry who was at the house that day. Well, years later, we found out that he had told everybody. in the neighborhood about this bullet that came through the Street's house. And his mother told us years later that everybody in the neighborhood was always talking about us, and we're, just sort of had this informal bet about how long we'd stick around.
Yeah, for sure.
And when they heard about the bullet, they were all like, well, they're leaving tomorrow. And she said, then the moving truck didn't show up. And she said, that's when you got accepted by the neighborhood.
Instant credibility.
Because instant credit, but it was investment. I'm here
Yes,
no
yes.
matter what happens, and I'm going to live my, and that's what that ministry was all about, which is I'm going to make my personal interest the same as the personal interest of my neighbor. So as I advocate for my kids, for better schools, I'm advocating for better schools for my neighbor's kids, and when I can tie my interests into your interests, then I can act selfishly. I can act like a normal parent would want to, because not only am I helping my own children, I'm helping my neighbor's children as well. And so, but we got that capital. That I think what Satan meant for evil, God meant for good, and we developed that capital with our neighbors because we didn't leave. So.
And it goes a long way.
Oh yeah.
And it takes a long time sometimes.
Oh, it does.
Oh, it does. Yeah.
I've been mentoring a kid for almost 8 years, and he's still, I think trust is still an issue, but I think, and what we tell a lot of our mentors in the program is, the fact that you come every week and show up and talk and hang out makes a ton of difference. So even if he's not saying it and he's not thanking you for coming, and but he just, I'll ask questions and, what are you getting in my business for? And it's like, because I care about you and I want to find out about you, but it's just that long-term relationship that, like you were saying, that if any relationship has to be over a long period of time.
Yeah.
And the other thing that stood out to me when you were talking was that everybody has something to contribute, and I think when it's the reciprocity that you talked about, and I think that's a huge part of someone breaking the cycle, is realizing that they have something to give back.
Yes.
And it's not all one-sided. I'm coming to, somebody's going to come give me everything, but I have something to give back. And sometimes it's something, monetarily, sometimes it's volunteering, but I've just seen that breakthrough happen with some people when, even kids are doing service projects. Kids at Shepherd are doing service projects, and they're collecting food bags for kids at another school in the neighborhood, and maybe those food bags are usually going to them, but in this case, they get to give back, and I think that's a huge switch in mindset.
And it gives them value.
Oh yeah.
It helps them to know that they have something to bring to the table, and that they are contributors, and that's important for them to know. It helps with their identity, with who they are in Christ, or in their family, in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
I remember when Shepherd first we wanted to make sure we served milk to all the kids at the academy, and we didn't have a source, and we started asking the parents to bring a gallon of milk a week. And I just remember how much pride they had walking that in, because they were contributing. I mean, they were paying for the school, not much obviously, but then there was more that they could add.
Yeah.
But your earlier point reminded me of a story Dan Fuller told, I remember, about one of the first mentors at Shepherd that he matched with a kid who came to him and said, I've gone to this house, I've set up a time to pick up the kid 5 times, and all 5 times I rang the doorbell and nobody's home. And Dan said, just keep going back, and eventually the kid was home one of the times, and the mentor said later he found out that the kid had been home every time, peeking through the curtains, and he realized it was just a test. Are you going to keep showing up? But he passed the test, and and he earned his trust. Well, I don't know if it was complete trust, but he certainly earned that capital. That this guy's going to keep showing up, so I might as well go do something with him.
Absolutely, that's a good story.
Yeah.
That's cool. I know in this line of work too, and just different ways we've been raised, we've had mistakes that we've made along the way, and other mistakes you've seen made. But what kind of comes to mind when you think about mistakes?
I remember working with at-risk youth in Atlanta, and we had a summer job training program, creating access and opportunity for youth to work so they can help pay some of the bills at home. And there was this one young man, and these guys were early teens, 13 and 14 years of age. And one of the young guys started working with the other 2, And he probably showed up for work for 1 week, and then after that, he didn't show up. And because we all lived in the same community, I knew where he lived, I knew his family, and so I approached him, I pursued him, and asked, why aren't you working? He said, I don't really want to. And I challenged him, you gotta work. Working is important. You're thinking about the misconceptions, some of that is reality, that people don't want to work, but I think we have to understand the why. And as it turned out, this young man was really checking. He was actually putting me to the test to see if I would commit to him. And what he really was looking for was another man to pursue him. So he grew up with the father, but his father divorced the mom, and so the mom and the kids moved from North Carolina to Georgia. So he didn't have a male figure in his life. So he didn't know me that well, and I believe he was really wanting me to pursue him, and I wrote him off. Initially, I just said, look, if you don't want to work, I was very hard on him because I know the struggle. I experienced it as an at-risk teen, and I knew how hard it was, how important it was to work hard, not only just to prove anything, but just to survive. And I knew if he didn't work, then he would set himself up for failure. But I pushed him, and I just almost just wrote him off to say that, fine, if you don't want to work, then I don't have anything to do with you. And I didn't realize just the mistake I made because I didn't think about what was going on inside of him. I didn't think about what he needed. I saw the outside. I saw that he wasn't working, right? And if you don't work, as the Bible says, you don't eat. And if you don't work, then you don't have a job. But I realized for him, and I'm not saying this is the case for every inner city kid, poor individual who doesn't want to work, but I'm saying for him, as it turned out, he was putting me to the test, and he needed me to pursue him. So something it was an emotional issue that he was struggling with, or even a psychological thing that he was going through. He needed me to pursue him, and I didn't at the time because I pretty much said, if you don't want to work, then I have nothing else to do with you at the time. Yeah. That was a big mistake.
Yeah, and the answer to your question is not having a hard time coming up with a mistake, it's narrowing it down. I mean, one point you made is I think one of the things I tell, I do a lot of teaching and I work with college age kids a lot, and I tell them, particularly Christian kids, I said, you guys need to be the smartest person in the room. You need to be the most well-read, and I think sometimes in the ministry, we have a lot of people who go into the ministry and, they're young and naive and idealistic, and God's going to be able to use them, but they're not very wise. And we make a lot of mistakes. And I can look back on myself 30 years ago and realize I was pretty naive. But I think I had my eyes open more than many, but I was still pretty naive. But I think we can make a lot of mistakes because we don't understand fatherless boys.
That's right.
Because we haven't really, we got to dive deep into psychology and know what fatherless boys go through in order for us to be able to understand how we can effectively minister to that child. If we don't understand the void in a child's life who is without his father, a boy in particular who is without his father, he doesn't have a dad, so he's going to love me. Why wouldn't he throw his arms around me? Here, I'm a father figure. But if we don't understand the trauma of the children experience, if we don't understand the rejection they experience, we don't understand the fatalism and the deep-seated inferiority that grows out of result of being rejected by what should be the most important relationship in your life, then we can't minister in an effective way, and we have to understand that, and I think this is very biblical, that our view of God is going to be most informed by our relationship with our earthly father.
Absolutely.
And if we've been rejected by our earthly father, then we're going to reject God because we're assuming he's going to reject us. And if we're going to love a child with the love of God, we have to understand that deep pain and that deep trauma they have. And then you add on top of that the trauma of violence and drugs and other things in the neighborhood. And we have children, we're ministering to children nowadays who have deep, deep psychological issues based on the traumas that they've experienced in their lives. And so the wonderful thing about a place like Shepherd is that we've grown enough and we're old enough and we've been around long enough and we're big enough that we can have people on our staff. We can have professional counselors on our staff who can teach us, the rest of the staff, how we should be doing it, and they can directly counsel. That's really difficult to do in a ministry with 3 staff people.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and it's really difficult thing for us to expect our mentors to understand. But if we can surround the kid with lots of different supports and programs and you've mentioned the continuum, but cradle to career. But if we can understand these assets that we're talking about now and how we can empower them with these assets, then we can see some success in helping kids stabilize their lives.
Yeah.
That's good.
I've seen us too, just personally and as a ministry sometimes, that it's easy for us to think we have the right answer for what somebody else needs to do. And I mean, that's all around us in society, but I think especially when you're in a helping profession, it's easy to come into one person's life or a neighborhood and say, oh, I see you need this in the neighborhood, or boy, if you just had this, if you could just do this. And I think that's a mistake that I've made, and a kind of ongoing temptation maybe for all of us to identify what somebody else needs as the solution to poverty in their case. And I think listening well is a great response to that kind of temptation. Is hearing what people are saying and letting people identify for themselves where they're at, and understanding trauma in a lot of cases, or just understanding a lot of life circumstances by listening well is something that I've continued to learn.
Yeah, I think one of the early mistakes I made was trusting people. We talk about needing to earn trust,
Right.
but I think it was a clear mistake in trusting some folks in the neighborhood who burned me and then saw me as a fool. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I remember one particular incident early on, just after we'd moved into the neighborhood, and we'd lived in Austin and Chicago, so this wasn't our first, inner city neighborhood to live in. But I was there was a vacant lot in the neighborhood that people were throwing furniture and trash on and everything, and I had arranged, I'd gotten a big pickup truck, and I met these 3 boys from the neighborhood. This was before we'd opened Gyrosports, and so I was trying to get to know the kids in the neighborhood. And so, I asked them if we'd be willing to earn some money to do some work, and they were eager to do that. And something came up, and I had to leave, and I went ahead and paid them in advance. I came home and the job wasn't done. There wasn't a surprise, was it? But I don't know if that hurt my relationship with those kids ultimately, but I never really was. I mean, they were pretty tough kids. I was never really able to earn a relationship with those guys. But I look back now, and that was foolish of me. I wouldn't do that with a contractor working on my home. I wouldn't pay him in advance, and these kinds of things. But I think what those kids probably walked away from that thinking, boy, that guy didn't know anything. What a fool. I can't believe, and they got paid, and they left. And I think we have to be wise.
Yes.
The scriptures say, be innocent as a lamb and wise as, as a serpent. And I think, if they see us as fools, then why would they listen to what we have to say? So.
Yeah. When you guys think about what you've seen working as far as addressing poverty, I mean, we've already talked about it, but how complex poverty is. What are you encouraged by, or what do you see around you that's working?
There's a story that I share quite a bit about a young man. This happened in Atlanta. I work with quite a few youth in Atlanta, and I'll name his name because it's a glorious story. Wally and his older brother Ashio, they were raised by the grandmother, and their parents were on drugs and were not in their lives. And Wally, most would say, was a crack baby, hyperactive, and we had a number of outreach ministries going on. We had sports, we had soccer, basketball, And I remember Wally scoring for the opposing team and getting excited. And so he's like, yeah. And his teammates would say, Wally, what are you doing? What are you doing? And so people just labeled him as a crack kid. And over the years, they lived very close to the Braves Stadium, and they had mentors in their lives. And they took them to their first baseball game. And then we had people that moved in the neighborhood to be a part of the ministry. And they established a relationship with Wally and Ashiel. Long story short, after leaving Atlanta, we established a church. And so we built a relationship with the boys, a number of the kids and their parents. So I heard say, because my wife and I moved away, we left Atlanta. And that's why, Tim, you made this point earlier, that it takes multiple people to pour into one person's life. They need mentors, right? One is great, but if you have a number of people to pour into their lives for over a long period of time, it will be better for their sustainability. So what happened was we left, but there were other families that were still there pouring into Wally and Ashiel's life. And the family that moved into the neighborhood approached the grandmother when Wally was a 10th grader in high school. He'd gotten in trouble. He was expelled from school. He was fighting. And they approached the grandmother because grandmother knew them, right? And they were white folk, not that that meant anything, but they were people that were different than Wally and his parents, and his family rather. And they approached the grandmother to say, we would like to help you support your grandson by allowing him to stay with us, stay with them until he finished high school. So and grandmother agreed. So from 10th grade to his senior year, Wally stayed with him, lived with him. And he received, and straightened up his life. Brothers just started serving in the community. We started a ministry. He was a part of the after school program, received a scholarship to Lincoln University. And he graduated with a degree in history. And he's now married with 2 kids. And I think he's working on his master's degree. He's in the church. He's in the Lord. He sends me text messages or calls me to ask how I'm doing and say, let me talk about the Pauline books. Like, what in the world? He wants to talk about theology. So he's a kid who started out as a crack kid who is now teaching in the public school system in Georgia. And that is a success story that God has blessed us with. It took more than just my wife and myself, but it was other families pouring into his life. He saw the love of Jesus. He saw people really walking with him through the hard times, and the Lord just blessed him, he had an awesome ability. He's an educator, right? Because God had just blessed him that way, and people came alongside to really help bring that out of him. So all that to say, that was a story. That's a story that I will share from this day on, because God did some amazing work in this kid's life.
I love that, because there's actually research supporting that 8 positive adult relationships in a kid's life is what makes a difference in reducing risk factors for them. And I think, we've tried to model that at Shepherd and are continuing to look at how do we create opportunities for relationship. And I feel like that's come up a lot as we've been talking about, I think you said nothing happens outside of the context of a relationship, and multiple positive adult relationships in specifically in a kid's life, but being able to surround them with, a mentor, but families that are pouring into them, church family that's pouring into them, just over a long period of time, lots of people pouring into a person's life, I think makes a huge difference.
I think I'm probably most excited right now about sort of a macro movement when it comes to serving the poor, and that is really the stuff that's coming out of, like, what Bob Lupton out of Atlanta is teaching in his book Toxic Charity, and the book When Helping Hurts, and people beginning to understand that whenever you do something for somebody that they can do for themselves, that you hurt them. And if we do nothing else but let that simple statement guide our ministry, I think we're going to be more effective. But then when you really get into it, you can begin to see the opportunity that we have. And what I'm excited about is that there's so many people out there who have things to bring to the table that they don't consider traditional gifts that I'm going to need to go help a poor kid. Like some guy who, maybe he's a brilliant businessman, but, he's, doesn't have great interpersonal skills or something like that. It doesn't mean a ministry like Shepherd or somewhere can't help them, or can't use him, and God can't use his talents and giftedness. And I think really the movement towards understanding economics within the church, within Christian ministry, understanding that one of the greatest challenges that people in poverty have is that they are traditionally marginalized from full participation in the economic life of a community, and that we can bring together resources to empower them to enter that economic life of the community. I mean, not just here, but abroad. I mean, so things like micro-enterprise loaning and things like that, these are all empowering things to help people provide for themselves. Lupton, in his book, tells a great story about these yucca farmers in Central America who were basically subsistence farmers, but growing more yucca than they could eat, but not being able to sell it. And an MBA, a young kid with his MBA from Harvard, going down there and working with them and convincing them that if they grew a different strain of yucca, they could sell the extra because the strain that they were growing was perishable too quickly. It would perish too quickly, but there were strains of yucca that would last longer, that would last long enough to get to market. You know, and then he did a little research, and he figured out that if they dip the yucca in paraffin wax, it'll last even longer. And now there's this cooperative in the area of these subsistence yucca farmers who have cooperated together. They've got a huge factory processing yucca. They're selling it, and they're all making money off of their land. And they're being raised out of poverty through their own work. But here's a kid with an MBA from Harvard who went down and said, God's given me a talent, and I need to find a place to apply this. To apply this talent to help others. And and he's living a rich life, and he's using his talents and his education. And there's so many people in the church that have those kinds of gifts that we could bring to bear on a ministry like Shepherd and caring for those in poverty.
Because I think you're absolutely right, but it seems like people are hindered sometimes from engaging in some of those solutions. What do you guys hear from people about why they don't engage, or what do you think?
I think it's fear. It's fear of all of the presuppositions and the assumptions that people make, and saying that, well, I've been burned by the poor. You experienced that, Tim, in your community, and they don't believe that people can change, and that hinders. I think another hindrance would be that they don't see instant improvement. So if you are walking with someone who's poor, and you're like, okay, I've done this for you, I've done all these things that really should have connected with you, and I don't see any changes. Therefore, I'm wasting my time. And that's the problem, wasting your time. I think God calls us to invest in people's lives, and it's by His grace and by His Spirit that we're able to stay with them. And it's the Spirit of God that changes hearts, not man. And so we have to believe that. So lots of prayer. We have to do a lot of praying into the process, and we have to be patient. But I think it's fear, and I think it's not seeing enough results in a timely fashion.
And I think the next piece is that many times people who want to serve, they have a lot of misperceptions. And I think ministries like Shepherd are beginning to figure out that it's the volunteers that are going to do the real work. And so our ministry has to be about pouring our resources into the volunteers to make them effective. That's
important.
And in education and training and I remember years ago when we implemented at Gyro Sports, we implemented an 8-hour orientation process for volunteers. And people said we were crazy. That's too long. People won't commit to that time frame. And we also made them pay for their own background checks and things like that. And people said, well, they're not going to do that. And this was almost 20 years ago. And the reality is we probably saw fewer volunteers go through the orientation than we would have if it had been an hour. But our retention was far, far better. The commitment of the volunteers was we saw dramatic improvement of that because they didn't come in naive. They came in knowing what to expect. Good. And they knew, because they had been told, this is going to take a really long time. And if you're going to commit to mentor a child, you have to understand that a mentoring relationship, studies show that if you're not going to mentor a child for 18 months, you shouldn't start at all. Because if it's less than that period of time and you stop, it actually, in the long run, does more damage to the child, because it, again, enforces the belief that they can't trust anybody and they're going to be abandoned and no one will stick around. So if you're going to do this, please know up front that you're going to hurt this child if you quit. And, you know, so don't do it. But those who did it were committed, and I think we saw great improvement. And I think any ministry that, you know, we have to have volunteers. The reality of the economic reality of the world we live in today is that there's never going to be enough money to hire enough people to mentor every poor kid on the east side of Indianapolis. But that doesn't mean there aren't enough volunteers out there that could do it. But they need to be trained.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we need to pour our resources into them as well.
Yep.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's good. I see, back to a point you made a minute ago, that even that MBA student who it would have been easy to think nothing I'm doing is applicable to helping people in this context, but I've seen multiple businesses even really grab a hold of the idea of what can we offer, how can we serve. Right now there's Rolls-Royce has a group of staff that come over and teach aviation club at Shepherd, an after-school program. And so it might have been hard to think about, you know, I'm sure they don't normally design after-school clubs in their spare time. And so it would have been easy to say, you know, my work as a aviation engineer has no applicability to a kid in the inner city of Indianapolis. But they were able to kind of look past that and ask themselves even, what do I have to give back? How can I contribute? And created this club. And there's been other businesses that invest in a similar way, giving their time, creating relationships, and offering a unique skill, which is an asset. It's asset building for a kid to learn in this perspective. He or she's not going to learn that otherwise, likely. And so they're building rockets and shooting off rockets in the parking lot. And that wouldn't have happened without some volunteers from Rolls-Royce saying, I've got some time and I think I can share something that I've learned. And I just love those kind of opportunities, creative solutions, again, to sharing what a skill and an ability that someone has and sharing those with kids.
Yeah. I mean, the old way of thinking would have said to that MBA student, well, you obviously have some talent in business. Why don't you go out and get into the business world and make a lot of money, and then you can contribute to your money. And we would say, so give us your treasure, you know, and let us do the work. And now it is, come and use your talent.
Yeah.
And I think that's making all the difference in the world.
Yeah. I know we think, you know, businesses or individuals obviously volunteer a lot, businesses volunteer. What have you seen anything working well from even a government perspective or the city's perspective as they look at addressing, obviously they have that mission of addressing poverty in the neighborhood as well, come at it from a different angle, but how have you seen that working well?
You know, I'll say this, I don't think I've seen what I'm about to say. I haven't seen it in a while. And boy, it worked beautifully for me. And I'm glad to use myself as an example because it's my story and I'm so grateful for it. But when I was in Atlanta as an urban youth, there was a program through the local government, it's called CETA, and they provided resources for at-risk youth to work. And they partnered with local organizations, nonprofits, even ministries. And I was a benefactor of one of those programs where I was able to work 8 weeks throughout the summer, receive a paycheck each week, and I heard the gospel. And so I believe if the local government is willing to link arms with the church or nonprofits and just understanding, you know, boundaries, I totally get that, and saying, well, we are not good in this area, but we'll look to you, church or nonprofit ministry, to do these types of things, but we'll provide the resources. You help with the relationship building. You help with programming in your area. I believe that's a great partnership for beautiful things that happen in people's lives, like my own life as well as others. I just believe that partnerships, collaborations are huge.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, because government can't be the answer, but there are things that the roles the government play that the rest of the world can't.
Yeah.
Right.
Big ticket roles. I mean, I think, affordable housing, addressing the affordable housing situation. There are organizations, non-profit organizations that are attempting to address affordable housing, and doing a good job, but on a very small scale.
Right.
And I think, I mean, the answer to your question is I don't see a whole lot from government nowadays, but when it works, it's when government says, we're going to provide resources, not direct money,
Right.
but we're going to help with whatever wraparound services are needed in order for this family, for the parents in this family, single parent, double parent, whatever, to be able to work. Which means we're going to make sure that there's quality daycare in town, and that maybe there are vouchers for quality daycare. We're going to make sure that there's affordable housing, that and the reality is there's very little of that goes on.
Right.
Because I think for a long time we looked at government as the solution.
Yeah.
Throughout the 60s and 70s with the Great Society, government was the solution, and even earlier than that in the 30s with the New Deal. The government was the solution, and then we began to realize government wasn't the solution, and I think the pendulum swung so far the other direction that we got to the point where we thought, well, the government doesn't have anything to add at all.
Yeah.
And I think we need to swing it back into the middle and to say there are certain things that government can do.
Yeah.
Like a city like Indianapolis, when we look around at this building and what's happening in our old neighborhoods, everybody, lots of people in ministry decry gentrification and everything else. But the reality is, if a city is going to have the revenue to provide services for the poor, there has to be some urban redevelopment. They have to have the property values go up in order to have tax revenue come in.
Right.
My friend Bill Taft always says there's no such thing as a healthy city with only poor people in it.
Correct.
And so we have to have a mix. But when that revenue comes in, the city really, the government really needs to be spending it on the things that stabilize communities. And a stable, affordable housing is one of those big ticket items that no ministry, as many houses as Habitat for Humanity has built, the thousands, and who they might be up to millions by now, that's still a relatively small dent in the housing need of a city like Indianapolis. And so my answer to the question is I think there are roles the government can play, and unfortunately, they're not necessarily playing them effectively right now.
I've been encouraged by even just, so FSSA that administers a lot of state programs had over the last couple of years had some really encouraging conversations with them, with their leadership about partnership and understanding kind of their role a little differently than I had heard before, which I was really encouraged with them reaching out to say, and understanding that organizations like Shepherd, like other churches, have the relationships in the community. So how does the state, at the state level, work in the context of relationships? They've got to be in partnership with churches, with other community centers, other nonprofit organizations. And so even that they were asking that question and thinking through that at the state level was encouraging. It felt like a step in the right direction, and getting kind of asking for input was really encouraging. And then the other thing that I think of too is on kind of the public safety side of things. We've had Shepherd specifically, but I know other places too have had some really good conversations in partnership with IMPD. And one of the things that comes to mind is when they did this whole Operation New Normal, where they went out into the neighborhood with their officers and with Shepherd staff and with Gleaners, Food Bank, and they just went around to people's houses and knocked on doors to see what their needs were, which was a lot different than what you typically have an IMPD respond with. And so I think I've been, again, just encouraged by some of those partnerships and looking at how we can continue those kind of relationships where, again, I think to your point, they use their expertise and we try to use our expertise to partner and work together on that. I think there's a lot of possibilities around that too. Well, great. Does anything else, when you think about such a broad subject like poverty, but does anything else really stand out to you guys?
Well, I think one of the things that's most important for for all of us is to be humble.
Yeah.
Particularly in the sense of recognizing how little we know. One of my favorite analogies, and I don't think it was even used in this context, was my old boss used to say, it's like, it's like two blind men trying to describe an elephant. They're each going to be able to describe for you what they're feeling, okay? But you combine those two descriptions and it's going to look nothing like an elephant, and I think each of us, we know a little bit about poverty based on our experiences and our education, but it's far too complex of an issue for any of us to be able to say, I got a good grasp on it.
Right.
I got it, As a matter of fact, in my teaching, I tell people all the time, if you ever hear somebody, a political pundit or somebody on TV say, poverty is caused by this, and they give you one thing, that's the cause of poverty, I say you can stop listening to them from that point forward, because they have no idea what they're talking about. Poverty is far too complex to boil it down to sound bites, to boil it down to one or two causes, and as a result, when we go into conversation about how to help people in generational poverty, we have to keep in mind how complex it is, and when we do, our responses are going to be complex. They're going to be subtle. They're going to be, they're not going to be simple, and simple solutions don't work, and we're not going to be surprised by anything, but we're not going to be surprised when something doesn't work, and we're not going to be surprised when it does work. Well, we might be a little pleasantly surprised when it does, but I have been reading and studying and living. I've been reading and studying about poverty, living among the urban poor for 25 years, and I'm only now beginning to feel like I even have the slightest inkling of what it's like, what it's all about, and what the last 25 years have shown me is how little I know, and so many of, and particularly, and it's one of the challenges sometimes we face with our volunteers, particularly if they're successful in a worldly way, because if they're successful in a worldly way, then all I got to do is apply what I know from this business over here to these people that I'm mentoring at Shepherd, and they're blown away when it doesn't work, and they're blown away when they aren't received with open arms as my little savior, but it's way too complex for that.
Yeah. I think, while Tim, you say it's being humble, I think it's being humble and also being patient.
Yeah.
There are no quick fixes, and it's a long journey, and I think you have to learn to celebrate the little accomplishments. If it's, my mentee was able to finish the week strong at school, didn't cut one class that week, you have to celebrate that. And if it means say, hey, you've accomplished something, let's go and have an ice cream cone or something. Don't give money, but just make sure there's an incentive there. It could be just an ice cream cone. But I think you have to make sure that you understand coming into it, similar to what you said earlier about empowering volunteers. You have to know the expectation is that it's going to take time. There are no quick fixes. You have to be patient, long process, and whenever you can see some accomplishment, man, go ahead and celebrate it. Celebrate them. They need to be affirmed on a regular basis because of all of the ills of poverty and how it affects people psychologically. You don't know all the struggles and how it has been it's traumatic for a number of them, right? People that experience poverty. So it's important for them to know that they are important. Yeah. And so you have to affirm them. And you do it by celebrating those accomplishments, even the little ones.
Yeah. I remember a couple of years ago, I should say at one point in time, I really struggled with that issue, particularly the sort of celebrations that the middle class wouldn't celebrate much, like kindergarten graduation and sixth grade graduation. And I remember Dr. White, the superintendent of IPS schools, struggling with this a few years ago, that the high school graduation celebrations were becoming, this madhouse of huge families standing up and applauding one kid as he went across. And to many people in middle class, we see, expect high school graduation is, well, it isn't even the bare minimum, of what we expect of our children. The college degree is the minimum, and so we don't even see high school graduation sometimes as something that really needs to be celebrated. But for people who come out of poverty, it does need to be celebrated, because those small victories along the way, and it's not, and for many of them, it's not a small victory.
Right.
But we have to, but we also have to be careful that we don't allow it to be thought of as the greatest thing that will ever happen.
That's right.
Because yes, this is an important accomplishment for you to have achieved, but you need education beyond high school.
Yeah.
Whether it's an apprenticeship in a trade, whether it's a college, whether it's military, they're going to train you for some career. This is the start of your advanced education, and this is an important step. But it's not the end.
Yeah.
But when you were talking, I thought, whenever you do strategic planning with an organization, we've done a couple with Shepherd. One of the pieces of advice you always get is make sure you have small marks along the way that can be celebrated.
Yeah.
And if we're doing that for our organizations, why don't we allow people to do it for their lives? So
Absolutely.
because it keeps morale up.
Yeah.